quickly pushing in from the west as we head through this morning. England and Wales, though, a much drier and brighter start. Plenty of sunshine as we head through the morning, although there will be some cloud bubbling up as we head through the afternoon. Those showers turning particularly heavy across western parts of Scotland this afternoon, and we could even see some snow across the hills, with temperatures closer to average here and a little cooler further south with highs of only 14 or 15 degrees. Through the rest of this evening, those showers becoming much more widespread across the UK, slowly pushing their way south and eastwards as we go into the early hours of Monday morning. The far southeast of England perhaps holding on to some of that drier weather for a time, but those showers will eventually reach all areas of the UK. Another chilly night, particularly across parts of Scotland, temperatures dropping down into the low single figures, but a little less cold further south, maybe 7 or 8 degrees. Monday starts a very showery day across the UK. Those heavy bands of showers continue to push their way south and eastwards through the morning. Some sunny spells developing behind those showers, but with a brisk northwesterly breeze that will definitely take the edge off the temperatures through the day. And we could even continue to see some snow across the hills of northern England and across Scotland. Another chilly day, temperatures in the south only reaching around 12 or 13 degrees.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, every Sunday at 9:30 when I'll be interviewing the key players in British politics and taking them to task.
This report basically says that he's not fit to stand trial.
With an upcoming election looming over Westminster, now is the time for clear, honest answers.
I agree.
And that's precisely what I'll get.
Is he indecisive? Incompetent?
That's the Camilla Tominey Show at 9:30 every Sunday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's election channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
I wonder, is this the fundamental distinction we need to make between Islam, which is a private religion people may practice freely amongst themselves, and Islamism, when you try and place those values upon other people, place that way of being, force it on people who don't want it?
Tom, I have been very much clear about this thing that Islam is a religion and people are free to follow that religion in the UK, in a free Western society. So we have no problem with people following their religion as long as it is not being imposed onto the wider society. And when you talk about drawing a distinction between Islam and Islamism, people like me, you and me, we are drawing that distinction. We're trying to maintain that distinction. But if you look at the commentator from the Muslim community, some commentator, they would like to blur this line and they would ask you, what is Islamism? Where does it exist? Sorry, it does exist. We see it. And the teacher, this incident is an epitome of that kind of, ideology being prevalent, in our society.
Khadija, do you worry that these views are typical for some sections of society? Do you think that there's a problem with some Muslim men, that they have perhaps views that we don't consider to be British values?
There are certain readings of religion which are misogynistic, which are discriminatory, which are homophobic. We need to be honest about it. We need to be calling it out whenever we hear these kind of views. It's been a long time that we are letting these kind of ideologies crawling in, spreading tentacles in British society, and we are just ignoring it in the name of respecting people's culture and religion. You are not suppressed in the UK.
Good morning and welcome to the Camilla Tominey Show. With Iran having launched a major drone strike on Israel overnight, a busy week in Westminster has turned into a very worrying weekend for the world. I'm going to be discussing the very latest news from the Middle East with the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Jake Wallace-Simons, as well as looking at this morning's top stories. This week, we finally received confirmation from the final CAS report that the fanatical trans lobby, aided by useful idiots in schools, the NHS, private clinics and the charity sector, have been responsible for arguably the biggest children's safeguarding scandal in living memory. But what consequences will these pronoun-obsessed gender ideologues face? I'll be asking the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins. I'll also be speaking to Margaret Thatcher's former economics advisor, Sir John Redwood, who'll be telling me why we can't afford net zero and what's going wrong at the Bank of England. The former Culture Secretary and Boris Johnson loyalist, Nadine Dorries, will be here in the studio and she won't be holding back, giving us her 2 pennies worth on the ongoing troubles in Westminster. And as the heat rises on Angela Rayner, will Starmer continue to stand by his shadow deputy PM? I'll be asking former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Sean Woodward, for his take on the affair. And the author Angus Hanton will be sharing his new book, Vassal State, which explores just how influenced our lives are in Britain by America. We're going to be covering a lot over the next 90 minutes, so do not think of going anywhere. Well, let's kick off, as ever, with the Sunday morning papers. I'm delighted to be joined by the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Jake Wallace-Simons. Jake, thanks for coming in, because I know you've had a very busy night covering for your own newspaper what's been happening in Israel. I found it interesting, obviously, that most of the newspapers changed up. What I found interesting was the Sun on Sunday changed up its front page to cover this missile blitz, as it describes it. So this is a story that sort of transcends the broadsheets, it transcends the foreign pages. You've written a really interesting opinion piece for us, the Sunday Telegraph, where you're basically accusing Biden of appeasement on Iran. And, I mean, I don't think you're being alarmist, but you are sort of raising the spectre of this escalating in something very, very difficult for the Western world.
That's right. I mean, the path that led us here really was one of American appeasement. Ever since Joe Biden took over in the White House, he spent his time with regard to Iran trying to get them back into a nuclear deal, which was what Donald Trump pulled America out of in 2018, I think it was, because it really wasn't working very well. And during that time of appeasement, he basically ignored his own sanctions to Iran, releasing $16 billion of frozen sanctions money into the Iranian coffers, partly as part of this ridiculous hostage deal where he got 5 Americans for a sum of $6 billion, which is $1.2 billion per head. I mean, it's quite a lot of money in incentivising further hostage-taking. But this appeasement led to the Iranians making more nuclear progress than they had before. All the key landmarks in terms of enriching uranium to 20%, 60% and so forth were achieved during that time. And the message that the Iranians received was, OK, we can push the envelope further and further and further. And the Iranian approach really is like grandmother's footsteps, that you sort of, when the back is turned, you take a few steps and you stop when the person turns back. But the Americans have never really brought themselves to turn around fiercely and stop them, to bring that sort of that deterrence to play. And so, therefore, the Iranians clearly have thought that they can launch this unprecedented massive attack on Israel and not experience a devastating response. That looks like kind of where the Americans are pressuring Israel to go now.
How worrying are Iran's nuclear capabilities as it stands today?
Well, look, they are, according to intelligence assessments, they're about a week away from enough fissile material for one bomb. That's a week of progress. So they could trigger that at any point. Then once you've got that material, you still need to get it to work on a warhead, and that will take a matter of a few months. That's the best assessment. Now, is that right? Is it accurate? We don't entirely know. They could have reached that threshold already, frankly. We're not certain. The eyes of the world have been firmly fixed on the Gaza conflict, obviously, and one wonders whether the Iranians have been so quiet because they've been pushing forward that progress in the background.
Well, how do you think that changes things in terms of the kind of perception of Netanyahu, the proportionality of his response to the October the 7th attacks? I mean, we've seen perhaps Foreign Secretary David Cameron not being quite as supportive as some might like. mark in how he's sort of framed the conflict in the Middle East. How does this now change the situation and change the sort of spectrum of Western support for Israel, do you think?
Well, I mean, frankly, I think that the inhabitants of the White House and indeed Downing Street and the Foreign Secretary himself should be embarrassed. They should be embarrassed because they spent the last few weeks attacking Israel rhetorically and undermining Israel's support, undermining Israel's capacity for carrying out and concluding a justified military operation to defend itself from these genocidal savages in Gaza. Over the last, few weeks or a couple of months, you've heard almost no criticism of Hamas coming out of the White House or out of David Cameron's mouth. Almost no demands for the hostages to be released, but constant criticism of Israel about disproportionality, about civilians and so forth. Now, of course, it's important to protect civilian life. We all agree with that. But they could have worked constructively with Israel to destroy Hamas while protecting civilians as much as possible. And the reason why they should be embarrassed now is that clearly the stakes have been greatly increased by this Iranian attack. Now they're pulling behind Israel. Now their previous lack of support for Israel are being shown to be ridiculously hollow because they're now, sending fighter jets into the skies to protect the Jewish state, as they should be doing. And they're making their previous position look utterly absurd.
Let's bring this back to Britain. I've kind of put a compendium of stories together which are in the Telegraph and given them the headline "Useful Idiots?" ? I mean, we read that a BBC Arabic presenter tells a show guest he should apologise for his Israeli sympathy. We've got anti-Hamas protesters defeating police bans. Obviously, we know that there are more marches that have taken place in the capital yesterday. We've got a pro-Palestinian activist making a throat-cut gesture at Israeli group.
I think the thing that draws all this together is that too many people don't realise that Israel's security is essential to our security. Because a scenario of world war that would drag us into conflict is very easy to consider. I mean, for example, if the Iranian attack were to continue, and if Israel were forced to respond and the Americans were forced to respond as well, that would be a moment where China, for example, would seek to attack Taiwan, splitting American forces and causing us as well to send assets into the Indo-Pacific. At that point, Putin could seize the opportunity to attack Estonia or Moldova and indeed launch missiles at London because we've been the primary supporter of Ukraine. That's easy to imagine. And suddenly we find ourselves in a situation where missiles are raining down on London. Our armed forces are enough to, fill half of Wembley Stadium? Our Trident missiles at the last test plopped into the sea. We've got an aircraft carrier with a rusty propeller that couldn't even get out of harbour. We're not prepared for war. And also, we would have people marching on the streets in favour of Gaza every Saturday, maybe coming up with new chants supporting Iran.
Yeah.
Iran, make us proud or something like that.
The situation where you'd have people on the streets of Britain chanting in favour of Iran, not least after everything's happened there in recent months and years with regard to, young women being killed for removing hijabs, and an uprising there amongst actually largely female progressives who want regime change, want to get rid of the Ayatollahs. I mean, how do you get to a situation where people are marching on the streets of London in favour of Iran? I know you're speaking in hypotheticals, but stranger things have happened, frankly.
Well, actually, I'm not speaking in hypotheticals because last week, or perhaps 2 weeks ago, there was the annual Al-Quds Day march taking place in London. That is an Iranian march that was started by the Tehran regime. It's been taking place year after year around the world, including in Britain, by Iranian sympathisers expressing support for Iran. That's already happening on our streets, attracting tens of thousands of people, including people expressing open support for terror.
What should happen about that, though, Jake? I mean, the police... We've had successive Home Secretaries saying the police have the powers to stop these marches and choose not to do so. Do you buy that rhetoric, or do you think the government needs to do more to say banning such marches?
Well, look, I mean, I don't think that we need further legislation. The problem is we've got the legislation that we need to ban, hate preachers inciting to violence up and down the country, to ban expressions of support for for terrorist groups on our streets and so forth. But the problem is it's not being enforced. And if the police were to enforce the law, these marches would not be able to happen because some of the organisers themselves are close to Hamas or have been close to Hamas in the past.
Yes.
So if that was taken out, the marches wouldn't be happening.
Let's just move over to Australia. Obviously, the killing of 6 people at the Westfield shopping centre in Bondi Junction would have been more prominent on the front pages had it not been for what happened in Israel last night. Let's just focus in, the Sunday Express has, on this police officer, this female police officer. I mean, it's a very distressing image, actually, but in newspapers, you'll know as an editor, Jake, you sort of take a decision, should you run that kind of shot? I think in this case you do, because what it's really summing up is the bravery of this young female officer. She's apparently been down the road doing something completely different. She hears screams, she goes in, she risks life to save life. She goes and shoots this guy. I mean, it does beg the question. I think this was not a terror attack. This was a man clearly with mental health issues. However, the vulnerability of shopping centres per se is always something that's personally worried me. I've got children. They want to go to shopping centres. You know, anyone can stroll in and out of them. And it's the thing about shopping centres, particularly like Westfield, is they can be home at that point to hundreds, if not thousands of people who I think are quite vulnerable. Begs the question perhaps about whether we should be arming our police in this country. Obviously, this copper was able to respond so quickly and so effectively because she carried a weapon.
Yeah, I mean, look, you know, she was an example of the best of Australian society and the best of the West, I think. And it reminded me a little bit of the siege in Nairobi, of the shopping centre there, if you remember, in 2013, when an off-duty SAS officer, Christian Craighead, went in by himself and rescued countless lives. So, yes, you know, extraordinary heroism. Total absence of cowardice, which is something that cannot be said of our political classes.
Actually, I haven't given this lady's name. Let's just name this lady.
Amy Scott.
Amy Scott.
Amy Scott.
Who I think must be in line for some sort of recognition of her bravery, because it's just extraordinary.
And shot this man, stopped him, and then tried to help him with medical attention, which was the right thing to do. It just shows that compassion alongside
CPR on the guy that was basically unleashed this reign of abject terror on ordinary people going about their business. And of course, our hearts go out to the families of the victims in all this. You know, a young mum, a baby in hospital. It's just a beggar's belief, really. Let's move on to a final domestic story, because it has again dominated the papers. Labour hoped this story would go away, Jake, didn't they? And yet we've got yet more testimony suggesting that Angela Rayner has lied about this two-home situation. She once bragged, I think, of being Prescott in a skirt, and we've gone from 2 Jags to 2 homes, Rayner. Is her position tenable as Shadow Deputy PM, do you think, after all this?
Well, I think she's become a liability, hasn't she? I mean, Labour has positioned itself as the clean party. You know, the Tory sleaze, all the kind of Partygate stuff, pointing fingers at Boris, and she was one of the main finger pointers, I think, and that she was in a hotly contested field in that
Often calling for others to resign. You must resign, publish your tax return, and all
calling the Tories scum memorably. Yeah. And now it seems that chickens have come home to roost, and she has become a liability to her
Although she's very
party.
useful to Keir Starmer, because she does keep the left of the party quite happy, and therefore it's going to be a void that he'll have to fill, and then you have to ask yourself, who's he going to fill it with? If he does ask her to step down, or indeed if she volunteers to step down this week. It's not looking likely at the moment, but that's a difficulty for him politically, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Angela Rayner is a unique politician. She's got those proper working-class credentials and working-class roots and those links, and that she's played on, a lot about her, being a young grandmother and all that sort of stuff. She's got a great appeal and a lot of support in the party, and her crashing and burning is very difficult for Keir Starmer, because how do you fill that gap?
Well, we watched that space this week in Westminster. Jake, I know you've got a lot more work to do on the Jewish Chronicle. I'll let you get back to that, but thank you for joining me this morning. Thank you very much. Coming up next, I'm going to be joined by former Cabinet Minister Sir John Redwood. I'll be grilling him on why he thinks the Bank of England has got a lot to answer for.
Dubes & Co. Weekdays from 6 p.m.
You think this country needs new gas power stations? Apparently, this will all be about trying to get some form of energy security. Rishi Sunak has upset people today with this suggestion, people saying that actually this would do more damage to climate change than it would do good. Where are you on it, Richard?
I'll tell you exactly where. We need a lot more gas power stations and nuclear power stations, because quite often the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Last week, we imported 16% of all our electricity because we haven't got enough capacity in the UK, and we're now totally over-reliant on renewables.
The part of the problem is the lack of storage capacity, which the government has finally got round to addressing. I think this as backup is actually quite a sensible idea. But they are not doing anything, as far as I can tell. At the moment, it will be retrofitted to have storage capability, which seems to be utterly bonkers. I mean, anyone who's got solar panels, you know very well you're storing up energy. So it's about storage as much as production. They could have gone, 20 years ago, we could have had nuclear power. We could have done more. We haven't looked far enough ahead in the future, and we are in grave danger of making the same mistake. I mean, the other side of this is, what is the difference going to be? Blackouts are you know, they're irritating and...
Irritating? It'd be disastrous. It would literally
they would
destroy
be
our
now.
economy.
Well, they would be now, but, you know, some of us remember 3-day weeks and things like that. And in fact, you know, I grew up thinking that everybody had, you know, at least a couple of days a week when they had to eat off a Primus stove and things.
This is, again, I don't want to harp on, but this is one of the problems in the politics in our country, isn't it? So many politicians, they just think in election cycles. Absolutely. They just think, what can I do and say to get my own backside re-elected at the next general election? They're not always looking ahead at, actually, politics aside, what is genuinely the best thing for this country? I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Dubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to GB News. You're watching the Camilla Tominey Show. Thank you for your company this morning. I'm delighted to be joined now by former Cabinet Minister Sir John Redwood, the Tory MP for Wokingham. Sir John, or John, if you don't mind me calling you that, thank you for joining us this morning.
Please call me John.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm interested in your updating your work on green policy. It's titled The $275 Trillion Green Revolution. Will Consumers Buy It? And I'm interested in that, John, because, as you know, I think our viewers and our listeners are a little sceptical about net zero. A basic question, can we afford net zero?
Well, not the way we're doing it at the moment, because it's too much top-down with government subsidising things that don't work very well and not popular. The point of my book is to say that please governments around the world understand if you want to do this, you've got to work with industry and business to find products that are better and cheaper and things that people want to buy. It will only take off if we all want to buy cars that they think are green and heating systems they think are green. I'm also pointing out that quite a lot of the current technologies, like the electric car or the heating pump, don't actually help solve the global carbon dioxide problem because we don't generate enough renewable power in this country. If you or I bought an electric car, if we could afford to, and added it to the system overnight, they'd have to burn more gas in a power station to recharge it. So what's the point of that? And there would also be a huge amount of CO2 generated by actually making the car. Same problems with the heat pump, where you need a lot of electricity when it's cold outside in order to make them work. And if that's not generated in a green way, it doesn't work. They're so far away from solving the problems of how you store green energy in a cheap and affordable way. And until you can store it, you're always going to need fossil fuel backup to run when it's really cold and the wind isn't blowing. So I pose all these difficult problems for them and say, if you're serious about getting CO2 down, go back to the drawing board, work with the market, not against the market, and understand none of this is going to work if you're lecturing, badgering, and making points to customers they don't want to hear, and if you end up banning things and trying to tax us out of existence.
The other point about the banning of petrols and diesels, a friend lent me their hybrid car last week, so I had a drive around in this car, and I sort of thought to myself, I think David Davis has made this point, that if you wanted people to improve and not use as much petrol and diesel and actually to have a sort of hybrid model of an electric that they can use for short journeys, and then, you know, 80% of journeys are short, 20% are long, so you're cutting down your petrol and diesel consumption to 20%, and you're improving your electricity use, or the use of an electric car, by 80%. Why didn't they specify that people should have hybrids as opposed to this arbitrary ban on diesels and petrols? It's a mistake, isn't it? Regardless of whether they've delayed the timeline on it.
It's a complete mistake for the reasons I've been describing to you, and the very good point you're making, that hybrid is a consumer bridge to a more electrical future, which is much more practical until they've sorted out the problem of range. And also helps a bit with my point that there's not a lot of point of adding a whole load of electric cars to the system until you've got a whole lot of reliable renewable electricity and you've got a surplus of it. And to do that, we're going to have to build a lot more grid, for example. These are the things that have to come first. You need the grid, you need the big battery storage, or you need the conversion of water to hydrogen using green energy. You need one of these technologies to be backed and to take off. I mean, I compare the green revolution with the digital revolution. And governments don't ban things or offer subsidies or grants in order to get you or me to have a smartphone or a computer pad. People buy them, even though some of them are quite expensive, because they do things we want to do and they provide a great service. That's what they've got to get to if their green revolution is going to take off. So listen, government, work with consumers. Don't start banning things. And we can't afford all the huge tax subsidies they're trying to put in to back up products that people don't want to buy. It's just ridiculous economics, and it's pretty bad politics. I think wherever you get to the point where the unpleasant green ban or tax is on the ballot paper, the green thing loses, as we've seen in quite a number of European elections already.
Talking about economics and indeed politics, you'll be familiar that Liz Truss has just produced a new book, 10 Years to Save the West, where she's highly critical of the sort of economic infrastructure of this nation, so to speak. She wrote, Kwasi Kwarteng and I agreed that there was a triumvirate of problems, the Treasury, the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility, which between them had presided over the drift of economic policy in Britain for 30 years. I wondered if you agreed with that analysis, or is it too simplistic, John?
Well, I've certainly been very critical of the Treasury and the bank over much of that 30 years when I've been making public statements on the subject. And what's been so depressing is whenever I've been very critical and said you're now going to have an inflation or you're going to have a recession, we normally do end up with either an inflation or a recession. And the bank says it didn't see it coming, or there were special factors. We had competition and credit control in the early 70s, bloated the money supply, ended up with a big inflation. They blamed the Arabs and the oil embargo. And then we had the European exchange rate mechanism. I was one of the lonely voices in the government saying, for goodness sake, don't do this. It will give us boom or bust. It actually gave us boom and bust. And same thing happened. They bloated the money supply. They printed pounds like they were going out of fashion. So they were desperately trying to keep the value of the pound down to comply with this silly scheme. And then once they got the inflation, the markets went the other way and the pound crashed and they had to put interest rates through the roof and they got a slump. It was an absolute disaster. All main political parties stupidly signed up for it. And we had this violent cycle. And now more recently, we've got a toned down version of that. We had massive overprinting of money under QE in 2021. I agree with 2020 because they needed to offset their massive lockdown somehow. And now we've got the opposite. They're destroying money by selling bonds at huge losses and burdening the taxpayer, and surprise, surprise, we've had a technical recession. And again,
remind us of the loss suffered by selling these bonds off, John. What does it amount to?
Well, so far, over about 18-month period since they've been selling them at a loss, the taxpayers have had to pay the Bank of England £50 billion, would you believe? And I seem to be the only MP who thinks this wrong. I don't want my number one spending priority to be paying subsidies to the Bank of England. And if you look at the OBR forecast, they say there are going to be tens of billions more losses to come, and they could lose another 40 billion this year, for example. Well, again, it's not my spending priority that we spend 40 billion on subsidising the bank. So my message to the bank and the government is stop selling the bonds, and that would cut the losses quite a bit. And look at what the European Central Bank is doing. They made the same error with QE and inflation that the Bank of England did. They're not correcting it in the same way. They're not selling any bonds in the market. They let them run off when they mature. The losses are much less and they're spread out over a time period. And they're not paying the commercial banks the full, much higher interest rate now on all their reserves. We never used to either. The Bank of England is. So that's another great big loss for the taxpayer.
But is the Bank of England basically failing the British public then? I mean, because this is kind of a catalogue of errors that you've identified here, being responsible for recent high inflation, selling off bonds costing us billions.
Yes, I think the bank has performed extremely badly over most of my adult lifetime. There have been little periods when it's got it right. We've had a few years when it's worked. But it's been these big lurches in policy. It was QE and now the quantitative tightening policy, which is doing all the damage now. It was an extraordinary policy. It's the kind of thing that Latin American central banks used to do and ended up with inflation, and we never did that. I could live with it in 2020 because of the extreme policy being adopted to close down a great chunk of the economy, but they carried on with it far too long, and now their correction is entirely wrong. No other central bank in the world is both selling huge numbers of bonds at colossal losses and getting it all reimbursed by the taxpayer. This is a gross policy error in the United Kingdom.
John, we've only got a minute left, so briefly, the next general election, do you think it's going to be a 92, a 97, or something completely different?
Well, it will be something different. Camilla, I never predict an election. I'm fighting. You must go to the commentariat and pollsters to deal with that. We've got several months left to this government, as I understand it. I think it needs to change some things for the better. And if we made this big change in the approach of the Bank of England, which the government's quite entitled to do, they signed off all the quantitative easing. It was a joint policy. We would then have some latitude for some tax cuts and for the money we might need to sort out the doctor's position, for example, and everybody would be a lot better off. So can we please, government, stop subsidising the Bank of England for a policy that is clearly wrong?
Do you think there'll be another fiscal event before the next general election?
Yes, I assume so. I assume that they are running until towards the end of the year, and I assume there will be perhaps an early autumn statement this year, which really means you get 2 budgets a year, and I'm urging them to sort out these financial matters. I think there are other things we can save money on. I don't think we should be spending as much on green subsidies either. And then we can give some more money back to people so that the tax position improves and the economy picks up. That's what we need to do.
So, John Redwood, we have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed for your wisdom and experience this morning. It's been lovely to speak to you. Lots more to come in the next hour. I'm going to be joined by Health Secretary Victoria Atkins and the plot author Nadine Dorries, straight off the back of a secret rendezvous with Boris and Carrie. You won't want to miss either of those 2 interviews, so don't go anywhere.
Variety Cruises have been sailing since 1942, and thanks to them, you could set sail in 2025. You have the chance to win a 7-night small boat cruise for 2 worth £10,000. With your flights, meals, drinks and excursions included, you can choose from any one of their 2025 Greek adventures and find your home at sea. You'll also win an incredible £10,000 in tax-free cash that you can use to make this summer spectacular. We'll also treat you to these luxury travel gifts. For another chance to win a prize worth over £20,000, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus 1 standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB04 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 26th of April. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Britain's Newsroom. Weekday mornings from 9:30.
It's a remarkable story, isn't it?
Amazing.
Extraordinary. And also, she was unflappable, apparently, the Princess Royal.
She's
just
brilliant.
refused to get out of the car and said, I'm not going anywhere. Extraordinary. Well, Jim Beaton was awarded the George Cross for protecting the Princess, and delighted to say joins us now, along with the former head of Royalty Protection, Di Davis. Jim, you won't remember, but I met you some time ago at the Imperial War Museum when Princess Anne was opening an exhibition to do with the George Cross, and you were there reunited with her. And you told me then what great admiration you had for the Princess, cool under fire, but you didn't do so badly yourself.
It was probably my job. And also, I had a wee bit of police training, not very much, but a little bit, whereas Princess Anne had nothing. And yet, the way she displayed it, you would have thought she'd been highly trained to deal with any type of that situation.
Even though you'd had some training, you took 3 bullets for the Princess. You effectively stood between her and a deranged gunman.
Well, I was supposed to be a protection officer, really, so I just tried to fuddle about. You must remember that back in 1974, there was no communication, and we were extremely lucky that Michael Hills, who was outside Clarence House and nearby, had got one of the fast police radios, or radios on his shoulder, so he was able to send a message out. Otherwise, we would have just been relying in the good old public to phone in and say there's something happening.
Yeah.
So times have changed drastically.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. So much more to come in the next hour. Very shortly, I'll be joined by the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins, and Michael Gove's nemesis, Nadine Dorries. I'll be getting their thoughts on whether Angela Rayner should remain as Shadow Deputy PM. But first, here's the news with Sam Francis.
Camilla, thank you very much, and good morning from the newsroom just after 10 o'clock. And we start with some breaking news coming to us. In the last hour, Israel says that its confrontation with Iran is not over yet. That's amid rising tensions following major drone strikes by Tehran last night. Iran is now threatening to launch a much larger attack if Israel retaliates. Iran's state media also carried a warning for the US, saying its bases would be targeted if Washington backs Israel's military response. RAF jets were used to shoot down Iranian drones last night, most of which were intercepted without causing any significant damage, though a small number did reach Israel, critically injuring a 7-year-old girl and causing some damage to an army base. Video, if you're watching on television, you can see here emerged showing a group of Iranians gathered outside the British embassy in Tehran, appearing to celebrate the attack. Well, former chair of the Defence Select Committee, Tobias Ellwood, told GB News that Israel's defence capabilities were key to containing the strike last night.
By any measure, this was a brazen state-on-state attack, harnessing the latest tools of modern warfare, those drones and missiles, to its full. The scale of which, targeting much of Israel, much of the country, would have caused a colossal loss of life had it not been for Israel's sophisticated Iron Dome air defense system. So Iran clearly now wants to draw a line under this after its attacks and so forth. But there's no doubt that this conflict in the Middle East is escalating.
Well, following last night's developments, Rishi Sunak has condemned what he called Iran's reckless attack in the strongest terms. Meanwhile, US President Joe Biden has pledged a coordinated international response, and leaders from the United States, Canada, Italy, Britain, France, Germany and Japan are all due to hold a video meeting this afternoon to discuss the attack. Angela Rayner is facing mounting pressure over her two homes row after a former aide told police that she had not told the truth about her real home. Her former chief advisor has given a statement to Greater Manchester Police contradicting her claims. Matt Finnegan said there was no doubt in his mind that the Labour MP's actual home in 2014 was with her then-husband, not at a former council house where she was registered to live. Police have this week launched an investigation looking into possible breaches of electoral law. The Deputy Labour leader promised to step down if it's determined she did commit a criminal offence, but said she has followed all the rules at all times. And Sir Keir Starmer says he does have full confidence in her. The Conservative MP Tim Loughton has announced he'll stand down at the next election, joining a growing list of departing Conservative MPs. He's represented East Worthing and Shoreham since 1997, but says it's wiser to leave 5 minutes too soon than continue for 5 years too long. His decision adds to the 64 Conservative MPs who are not seeking re-election. The veteran backbencher becomes the 100th MP overall to step down. The family of a man who killed 6 people in a stabbing attack at a shopping centre in Sydney yesterday has described his actions as truly horrific. 40-year-old Joel Cauchi was identified as the assailant who carried out a killing spree near Bondi Beach. 5 people, 4 women and a man, died at the scene. Another woman, the mother of a 9-year-old baby, later died in hospital. And her child, who was also attacked, is understood to be recovering well. The family of the attacker say he had been suffering from mental health issues since he was a teenager. And they released a statement in support of the police officer who killed him, saying she was only doing her job. The Premier of the State of New South Wales, Chris Minns, has paid tribute to the emergency crews and members of the public.
Many people would be showing real anger at so many people having been killed and real loss of life. And the individual stories of those that have been killed that have been reported in the media are heartbreaking. I don't want to search for a silver lining, but it has been incredible to see complete strangers jump in, run towards the danger, put their own lives in harm's way to save someone that they've never met before. And look, there's not too many positives to take out of a horrifying event, but we've got some wonderful people in our city.
That's the latest from the newsroom. I'll be back at 11 o'clock. Until then, you can sign up to GB News Alerts. Just scan that code there on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now, though, it's back to Camilla.
Thanks, Sam. Welcome back. Lots more still to come today. In a minute, I'm going to be speaking to Victoria Atkins. The former PM Boris Johnson has criticised government's proposals for a ban on tobacco, which he said has the party of cigar-smoking Winston Churchill is, quotes, completely nuts. What does she make of these comments ahead of the proposed bill on Tuesday? I'll also be speaking to former Northern Ireland Secretary Sean Woodward. Does he think Angela Rayner can hold on to her position as Shadow Deputy PM or resign, as she's called for a number of colleagues to do so before? Former Culture Secretary Nadine Dorries will be here to spill the beans on the Westminster chaos, and I'll be asking her whether her close confidant Boris Johnson is planning a comeback. Of course, I'll be asking her that. And I'll be joined later by the author Angus Hanton, whose new book, Vassal State, looks at whether the UK has become the 51st state of America. But before all that, let's bring Victoria Atkins, the Health Secretary, into the conversation now. She's also the Conservative MP for Louth and Horncastle. Lovely to see you this morning, Health Secretary. Let's start with events overnight in Israel. How worried should GB viewers and listeners be about this escalation in the Middle East?
Well, this was a significant attack by Iran on Israel, and of course our thoughts are with everyone who have been affected by these attacks. And let us not forget, this wasn't just drones, this was also apparently missiles being fired over the region into Israel. Now, I hope your viewers will understand this is a very fast-moving military situation, and so I'm limited in what I can tell people and how I can update people. But what we do know is that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary and others are working with our international partners to try and de-escalate tension in the area and to support Israel in this difficult time, but also to ensure that we do not see further attacks by Iran. We do not see this, because none of us want to see the humanitarian impacts that this is having in the region.
I appreciate your words there about de-escalating the current tensions. However, I'm assuming that Britain will step up its military support to Israel should the time come to do that.
So you've just stopped, my sound's just stopped, but I'm going to answer anyway, because I know that your brilliant sound people will be able to get the sound back to me. I think you were asking me about the United Kingdom standing with Israel, and you are right. Of course, we as a free democracy want to stand with the people of Israel. Israel is the only democracy in the region. It had that terrible, terrible attack in October, and we remind ourselves that there are still hostages that are held captive by Hamas, and of course we want those hostages to be freed. We also want a humanitarian pause so that we can get aid into the affected area. That is a really important point. But we will be working across our free democracies across the world to ensure that we stand with Israel, but we do so to try and de-escalate the tensions in the region, because nobody wants to see an escalation in the sorts of military activities that we have seen in the last 12 hours.
Health Secretary, can you hear me? You said you had a problem with sound. Can you hear me clearly?
I'm afraid I have no audio.
OK. We're going to go to a break now and try and get the Health Secretary back so that she can hear me, because I'm obviously intrigued to hear her responses to some of my questions about the CAS report into the transgender situation with children in the NHS and indeed in schools. So let's just have a quick pause now and we'll try and get Victoria Atkins back so that she can hear me loud and clear.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels we're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Children's stories like Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland now come with a trigger warning at universities, alerting readers to possible themes of white supremacy.
Yes, these warnings are being applied to colonial narratives. That's the claim, commonly found in adventure stories and famous novels from the Victorian era. Well, joining us now is the actor Charlie Lawson. And Charlie, these warnings have been applied to Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland. What's this university getting at?
Well, look, first of all, this is nothing new. We hadn't heard about it for a while. Universities have been doing this over the last couple of years. I remember having a chat with one of your colleagues. But when Gabriella, the lovely Gabby, phoned me up today, I had to beg her to put me on after 9 o'clock because I found myself getting rather irate about the whole thing. But I will do my best to be very polite.
Yes, keep it clean.
Yes, look, which is quite difficult for me, as you'll appreciate, over this subject. Look, this is universities just jumping on the same trying to be relevant bandwagon. Is it any wonder that we look at the quality of graduates from university, and in my humble opinion, some of them are slightly disappointing. But I did phone a couple of people I knew who had sons and daughters at various leading universities, and they had been speaking this morning. And thank the Lord, they think it's a complete load of bloody nonsense, as I do. Give the C.S. Lewis Centre a ring in East Belfast, because that's where your man came from. And I think you'll find you'll get short shrift, because we're not all about that in East Belfast. We don't censor anything.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other. Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show, where I hope we've resolved our sound problems with the Health Secretary, Victoria Atkins. Health Secretary, can you hear me?
Yes,
Good stuff.
I can. Yes.
Fabulous. Let's just talk for the remaining time about the Cass report. I suppose the simple question, you've been quite your rhetoric on this has been really strong. You've said that the NHS must reveal the fate of 9,000 transgender young people treated by the Tavistock Clinic. Obviously, this report suggesting that children have been given puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones, despite, as Hilary Cass has said, remarkably weak evidence, that does vindicate, J.K. Rowling, feminists, people like me have been writing about this for years. I suppose the question that remains for the government is, if you were going to go out tomorrow as a child and want to be prescribed puberty blockers, you still could, right?
Well, first of all, may I start by thanking you, Camilla, and the many, many other people who have battled against this culture of secrecy and intimidation and ideology over recent years. People have dared to ask questions, perfectly reasonable questions about the form of some of these treatment pathways, whether they're the right thing in the best interests of children, and they have then been shut up by people who focus only on the ideology rather than on the very, very complex needs of many of these children and young people. And if I may, I'll take just a moment to reiterate my disappointment that the Labour Party has been part of that culture of secrecy and intimidation and ideology.
Although
we have been told
this madness
by my
has unfolded
counterpart
under the Tory
that we should
watch.
get over it.
This madness has unfolded under the Tories' watch. We've had a situation where teachers, even now, are disregarding the guidance that you've issued. So the argument for the government, I think, is you're going to have to legislate, because we've got stories of a Brighton GP at a private clinic giving out puberty blockers to children after 10-minute consultations. The report is welcome, the trans guidance is welcome, but not if it isn't legally binding. Otherwise, these ideological zealots can just continue with this. So my question to you as Health Secretary is, when will puberty blockers be banned for under 18s? When will that happen?
So the NHS has issued immediate guidance that puberty blockers will not be prescribed routinely on the NHS. The reason that word routinely is in there is because clearly if there are young people who are currently on those medications, those drugs, then there has to be a clinical pathway to taking them off those drugs, because they are so very strong. We need to ensure that the physical and the mental impact of taking, of removing them onto other pathways is in the best clinical needs of those children and young people.
But
what we want
guidance
to do is to
isn't
stop
enough.
children and young people. So what we also
Guidance for
want
the
to do
NHS
is to stop.
But let me just make this point about banning, sorry. But the banning thing, I raise this because obviously we've got this tobacco legislation that's been proposed. You're wanting to ban tobacco sales to the under 15s. You're talking about Churchill. Obviously, Boris Johnson made this point about Churchill would never have banned cigars. You say that maybe he would have. So we're happy to ban tobacco products, but we're not happy to legislate against puberty blockers for the under 18s, even in the face of this overwhelming evidence.
So, Camilla, let me take it step by step, and I'm sorry, this is quite complicated, so forgive me if my answers aren't like one word long, because actually I think this is complex and deserves a bit of detail.
Okay.
So in relation to puberty blockers, private clinics and international prescriptions, because all of these things have been raised over recent days, understandably so, I am working at pace with my officials to see what we need to do to block off these avenues of prescription, because given the devastating report by Dr. Cass as to the, her words, shaky foundations of the evidence for these drugs being prescribed for children and young people suffering from gender dysphoria, we need to ensure that that cannot and will not happen in future. Now, the wider question about guidance, in fact, is something that my Cabinet colleague, Kemi Badenoch, has talked about today with her role as Minister for Equalities. We need to tackle this ideology that exists in some parts of the public sector that somehow government guidance is there and they don't need to follow it. This report is so clear, so thoughtful, so thorough that we expect now all clinicians, whether they are NHS or otherwise, all clinicians to abide by the Cass review findings. CQC, we have been in contact with this week, and my officials are meeting them again on Monday. They are the body that are responsible for licensing practices to prescribe. It's a highly regulated activity, and CQC have confirmed that the one gender clinic, private gender clinic, that is licensed to look after children and young people with gender dysphoria has no licence whatsoever to prescribe these drugs to children and young people under the age of 16.
Okay.
I want us to go further because I'm very worried about that group of young people from 16 to 25 as set out in Dr. Cass's report. But these are, these are many years of ideology that we are now combating. We're having to, really deal with on the evidence, but we must also do this in a caring and compassionate way, because at the centre of all this are children, young people with complex needs and their families, and we want to support them whilst, of course, we're ensuring that the guidance and the structures around them are really important. Now, let me come on to smoking, if I may, because that's a fair challenge.
Very briefly, because I feel we're running out of time.
All right. Okay, so we all know the evidence with smoking. It causes 1 in 4 cancer deaths, kills 80,000 people a year. But pretty much every single minute of every single day, someone is admitted to hospital with a smoking-related condition. I don't know any smoker, adult smoker, who's pleased that they took it up. And we know that most smokers start before the age of 20. So we are not, absolutely not, stopping the ability of adults today watching this programme who smoke cigarettes or tobacco. We are not stopping them from being able to carry on buying their cigarettes, their tobacco. What we are doing is saying that from 2027, anyone who turns 18 will not be able to buy cigarettes legally in shops, because the impact for them as individuals, but also for people living around them, we all know the dangers of secondary smoke, and indeed the impacts on the NHS are so significant that we think this is we think that there is a real time now for this culture change. And what is more, we know that the public agree with us, because in recent surveys, some 71% of people welcome this change. So this isn't about affecting adults. This is about helping protect our children from the awful, awful addiction of nicotine, because there is nothing freeing about an addiction to nicotine.
I know, but
that's very much where I come from.
You've written in the Telegraph today that you think Churchill would support this ban. I just remind you of another of his quotes.
No, I haven't.
If you destroy a free market, then you create a black market. That's a Churchill quote, Miss Atkins.
So in fairness, the copywriters of the Telegraph have had some fun with the headline. What I've said is that I quoted Winston on a point about fact and reality.
Okay.
And the facts and the reality I've already set out. In relation to the black market, though, that's a really important point. I used to prosecute criminal gangs that would bring counterfeit cigarettes in. It's why we're investing, as part of this package, £30 million to ensure that Border Force, HMRC and other law enforcement agencies can tackle the illegal market.
Okay.
And by the way, when we raised the age of smoking from 16 to 18 before, we saw the prevalence of smoking in that group of people fall by 30%.
Okay.
So we think this is actually very much in line with what we've already done as a society to try and help people off cigarettes and not being hurt by the tobacco, by the tobacco and the nicotine that we know are in those tobacco products.
Health Secretary Victoria Atkins, thank you very much indeed for joining this morning and bearing with us through that sound problem. Wowzers, right, well, let's get straight into the next conversation. I'm joined by Nadine Dorries now in the studio, the former Culture Secretary, close ally of Boris Johnson. She's here with her book, The Plot, which I'm sure you will have read about, you would have heard about on this station and beyond. Nadine, lovely to see you.
Hello,
been waiting for you to
morning.
come into this studio for quite some time, so I'm
very sorry
delighted
about
you're
that.
here in the flesh. Now, I understand you were with Boris and Carrie Johnson last night, and I just wondered... yesterday afternoon, and I wondered what the general chat was, perhaps about a political comeback for the former Prime Minister. I mean, where's his thinking at? Can you give us any insights at all on that?
Do you know, it's bizarre. I saw a story, I think it's in The Sun today, which says that there's talk about a plot to bring Suella in and for Boris Johnson to become Tory party vice chair. I mean, I actually almost spat out my drink as I read it. You know, it's just a nonsense. Why would anybody think Boris Johnson wants to come back?
Well,
given
he
the
seems
way
to have
he was
indicated that this
removed.
week.
Well, he said
this week.
No. He hasn't ruled out not coming back. But when? You know, this is a man with a winning record. He won the mayoralty in London twice as a Conservative. We'll never do that again. He won the Conservative Party a majority, an 80-seat, once-in-a-generation majority.
And then people
a bigger percentage of the vote share than Tony Blair did in 97. And the only substantial, truthful reason why he's removed as Prime Minister was because he didn't eat a piece of cake that was brought to him at his desk for which he received a fixed penalty notice. That is the only element of truth in the whole saga
we'll get
of
into
Boris
the plot.
Johnson's
We're going to get into the plot in a moment.
Why would he come back if MPs removed him in the way he did?
But he's hinting that he would one day want to come back. And of course, we remember the Cincinnati
he's a Conservative.
reference. But you're suggesting, I mean, the idea of him coming back as vice chairman of the party.
Honestly, that is thought that.
So you're saying he'd only come back if he could be party leader and
No,
by
I didn't say that
association
at all.
Prime Minister?
No, you said that, I didn't.
Well, what do you
What
think?
I said was that one day, as in Boris's own words, you know, can we envisage a Conservative Party of the future without Boris Johnson playing a major key role? Absolutely not. It's unthinkable. You know, this is the winner. He is the winner. Why would the Conservative Party contemplate that? And actually, when you look at what's happened to the Conservative Party since they removed him, what has happened? It has sunk faster than a stone. And the idea that, we could move forward and regain
But if he's a
the
true
ground we're going to lose.
If he's a true Conservative, sort of somebody who's a poster boy for the Tory cause, so to speak, then surely he'll be champing at the bit to come back and help Rishi Sunak to campaign to win the next general election. Because I would imagine Boris Johnson doesn't want Captain Snooze Fester-Rooney, Captain Hindsight, Keir Starmer, to be the next Prime Minister.
Now, they were all united in the fight against socialism, and we don't want that to happen. But I think, with the greatest of respect, there are basic courtesies which need to take place, given what Rishi Sunak did over a 7-year period to make sure that he became Prime Minister. There are certain things that Rishi Sunak has to do. One of them is he needs to swallow a bit of humble pie and accept the fact that he's taking the Conservative Party into a massive, crushing defeat, a defeat which may see us back in Westminster as the third party. And I think if he wants the help of Boris Johnson, he's going to have to pick up the phone and ask for it.
Is that you speaking or Boris Johnson?
And that is a basic
Is that what Boris Johnson
No, I'm the
saying?
person sat in the chair. That's me saying that.
All right. So on Rishi Sunak, you talk about him, conniving to be Prime Minister for 7 years. This is what I find interesting about the plot, because obviously you lay a lot of the blame at Michael Gove and some of his acolytes like Doogie Smith and others. But at the same time, I suppose my key question for you is, who do you think was really responsible for Boris Johnson's demise? Was it Michael Gove or was it actually Rishi Sunak?
So it was I do feel sorry for Rishi because he was taken in by a group of people, Dominic Cummings, Michael Gove, Dougie Smith, and these people are just amazing operators. They've been operating at the heart of the Conservative Party for 20-odd years. I mean, Liz Truss and I have had a number of conversations about this, and she was aware of them. She was aware of them 25 years ago. So they've been operating at the heart of the Conservative Party, very much deciding who will be Prime Minister and who will be removed as Prime Minister. Michael Gove's, the stabbing Boris Johnson in the back, who was behind that? Well, Dominic Cummings and Dougie Smith, and the same people are always there. And in fact, the plot starts actually with a detailed interview with Ian Duncan Smith.
Yes.
Who was told by Michael Gove back in 2002-3, we've put you in as leader. What you have to do is crush and burn the Conservative Party so that from it, a new, modern, Liberal party can rise from the ashes. When Ian Duncan Smith said, well, actually, no, I quite like conservatism and I think we can win as Conservatives, they got rid of him. And it's happened ever since. They put in place, and there's always one of them, or more of them, right at the centre of number 10, right at the Prime Minister's side, driving the show.
And I understand the premise of that, and also let's go on in a minute to talk about the sort of yellowization of the Tory party and the idea that righties aren't able to stand, and that CCHQ keeps to want to recruit a lot of Liberal Democrats to stand in Tory seats. But just back to one sentence that you said at the beginning of this conversation, you said that Rishi Sunak had spent sort of 7 years trying to become Prime Minister at the expense of Boris Johnson. Are you saying that when he was running the consultation into disabled toilets, when he was at the Communities Department, that he was doing that, when he was being extremely deferential to Boris Johnson, calling him Prime Minister, wasn't calling him by his first name? He very much played this sort of apprentice to the master role. Are you saying even then that this young MP is plotting to bring down Boris Johnson?
So he won his seat in Richmond, again, detailed in the plot. How he won his seat in Richmond, I think, tells you all you need to know. And the selection process that took place, the role of Dougie Smith in him being selected for that seat. And indeed, if you look at it's in fact, I'm doing a second book now to follow on from the plot. If you're going into slightly more detail on these issues, if you look at how his selection took place and look at his role as Chancellor. So there were a great many things that Boris Johnson did when he was Prime Minister, levelling up. And he was really fantastic. And actually, the reason why he won the 80-seat majority was because he had a foot in every camp. He, on the left, he had net zero, he had animal welfare, and over on the right he had Brexit, and he thought tax cuts. And when Rishi Sunak became his Chancellor, He blocked every
Rishi
single
Sunak isn't the
measure
first Chancellor
as
in history
Chancellor.
to block tax cuts.
Well, Gordon Brown did it famously with Tony Blair.
I know, but Treasury orthodoxy has been complained about, you know, since the dawn of Conservative time. I take your point.
Well, there's a lot more to it than that, Camilla. It's not just tax cuts, how they were done.
I appreciate exactly what you're saying, and I totally agree with you when it comes to Boris Johnson being an extremely effective campaigner and communicator. He had an 80-seat majority, and unfortunately he squandered it because
he didn't squander it,
because
Camilla.
he didn't perform well enough as Prime Minister.
No, he did,
because
Camilla.
he's great at campaigning but not at governing. And you have to say that he made extraordinarily bad choices. What on earth was he thinking, first of all, bringing Michael Gove back into the tent after he'd been stabbed in the back
so,
in 2016?
So that's explained
that's
in an
error
interview.
Of judgment. What was he thinking having Dominic Cummings, who he knew was Michael Gove's right-hand man from the very beginning, as his own right-hand man? Boris made a series of catastrophic errors in who he had in the team around him. Why can't you make him take responsibility for it rather than blaming everyone else?
In fact, I let him explain in his own words in the plot why he did that. And it's actually really fascinating because Michael Gove obviously persuaded Boris Johnson. I think I do ask Boris in the book, did he apologise to you? And I think Michael Gove did. And I can't remember Boris's exact words now. But at the end of that conversation with Michael Gove, he trusted Michael Gove. And what he believed was
an error.
If I can just finish, what he believed was that the primary concern of people like Michael Gove and Dominic Cummings was to drive the agenda of the government forward, to make the UK a better place, to make sure that we delivered Brexit. And I think he says in his words at the beginning, I think it's Wordsworth, how great it was to be in that dawn, to be alive. And that dawn, how great it was to be alive. He believed that what they were doing was working with him to achieve those goals he set out. And it took him a long time to realise that what they were actually doing was working against him in order to get Rishi Sunak.
Although wasn't there a part of him that thought to himself, I want to be the front man here, I want to be the showman, I want to be the performer, but I need a details guy, so I'll put Gove on detail in the background. I'll sort of give him this pseudo-deputy PM role, but you're saying that Gove then abused that power in order to unseat. But
Boris says that in his own words
but
in the
Nadine,
book.
anyone that's ever sort of spoken to anybody about Michael Gove, and if you look at the history of the situation, you look at 2016, anybody with a modicum of intelligence, indeed half an education as an old Etonian and a former Oxford graduate, would have been able to say, you probably can't trust Michael Gove.
No, and therefore it's better to have Michael Gove inside the tent than outside the tent.
All right.
It was always fascinating how, when we had a cabinet meeting, again detailed in the book, it was always fascinating how at cabinet meetings that journalists at Michael Gove's old newspaper, The Times, knew chapter and verse what happened in that cabinet meeting before we'd even left the building.
Yes, once a journalist, always a journalist, you could argue.
Well, that's the reason why he's never held high office. He's never held high office because Michael Gove is infamous for his leaking. But it was actually and David Cameron would have done the same thing.
Although he won't be the first cabinet minister in history to be infamous for his briefing.
I'm sure lots do, but I don't think they do it with such
Let's talk about Kemi
pathological...
Badnoch's criticism of you in this book. She says that you're a conspiracy theorist.
Yeah.
What's your response to that?
She's slightly obsessed, and what I'd say is...
she might say you're obsessed with her relationship with Michael Gove.
Well, I think we're all slightly obsessed with Kemi Badnoch's relationship with Michael Gove, aren't we? Given that Michael Gove has been her sponsor and her mentor.
She says they've fallen out.
Yeah, and, you know, intriguing reasons as to why, which I think we're all going to find out about fairly soon. But it's you know, Kemi Badnoch, so Dougie Smith...
What do you mean by that?
Well, just let me answer this question first. Dougie Smith is one of the best friends of Kemi Badnoch's husband, Hamish.
Okay.
Dougie Smith has also been a mentor of Kemi Badnoch. Dougie Smith's wife, Munira, wrote all her speeches when she was in the leadership husting. She's very much the product of Dougie Smith and Munira.
Okay.
And you know...
She might argue she's the product of herself.
And, well, you know... So I disagree with that point, but I think you can judge somebody by their friends. And when somebody is being pushed into a leadership position, like somebody like Dougie Smith, who has created chaos at the heart of the Conservative Party for 20 years. Well, he's
out of number 10, isn't he?
He's out of number 10 since the plot came out. But I don't think Rishi Sunak quite knew. I know Rishi's read the book. I don't think Rishi Sunak quite knew the truth and the depth of Dougie's role over 25 years, or that of Michael Gove. Both have been sidelined, as well as Dominic Cummings. But, He's still on the Conservative Party payroll. He's still earning £100,000 a year from the Conservative Party.
You mentioned William Ragg at the weekend. You've spoken, I think, to the Mail on Sunday about the honey trap MP and his involvement in Boris Johnson's demise. Who do you think was William Ragg's master in all this?
Oh, well, you know, there's a reason why Rishi Sunak didn't want to remove William Ragg's whip.
So it's Sunak?
There's a reason why, I believe, I'm led to believe, it was Graham Brady who also insisted that Rishi Sunak did not remove William Ragg's whip. So we will see. Yeah, William Ragg was absolutely instrumental in the Pincher affair, which was a sting, which we are, as time has passed now, we're going to learn a lot more about.
Are you saying
No.
Sunak?
I don't. I think Sunak's slightly, you know, there are people working for Sunak who are doing the operating below Sunak. I think sometimes maybe he's caught unawares by some of the things that the people who work for him are doing. But William Ragg was very closely associated with the Chris Pincher sting, which brought down the Prime Minister. But I have to say, when I was writing the plot, one interviewee after another kept saying to me, you need to include William Ragg in this. And William Ragg is such an insignificant figure. And you could, you know, if you want to find William Ragg, look for him in the subsidised Westminster bars or in the bar of the Carlton Club or in front of a camera anywhere calling for someone to resign. He's such an insignificant, quite unintelligent figure.
Well, hang on, he's not here to defend himself. He could just say he's being sociable when he's in the Carlton Club and the other parliamentary bars.
Yes.
All right, well, OK,
so
we've made your point on
the
Ragg.
cutting room floor, and I wish I'd kept it in.
All right, fair enough. Well, you have got a second book to come. Let's ask you a final question, Nadine, while we still have the benefit of your wisdom on David Cameron. You once said he had a woman problem. Does he still have a woman problem? Or does he just have a problem with you, Nadine,
Camilla? No, it wasn't just me who said that. There were polls that showed it quite significantly. It was talked about a lot.
Why do you say that? I mean, do you still think that's the case for the Foreign Secretary?
The polls showed at the time that women just weren't trusting or wanting... I mean, we would probably, if he didn't have that problem, we might have got a bigger majority in 2015 and not gone into a coalition.
But what did you make of his appointment by Boris Johnson? By Rishi Sunak as Foreign Secretary? Because obviously there's the link to Richmond there, because I think he wanted William Hague, and William Hague said, no, why don't you have David Cameron? And that could be evidence of your sort of plot.
There was a lot going on behind the scenes on that, and I think Cameron was very quickly popped into place, and I think he's doing a fantastic job, by the way, as Foreign Secretary. He was popped into place for a reason. I think the reason was there was obviously things are very badly going the wrong way. And what if Rishi Sunak, it was at the time that votes no confidence were being talked about, and what if Rishi Sunak was about to be removed? Well, there are plenty of Tory grandees and people who would not want Kemi Badenoch or anybody
So you
from
think
the right.
Cameron might be positioning himself to return as leader? Very, very, very quickly, just literally a simple question and a simple answer needed because we're running out of time. Rishi Sunak, will he still be Prime Minister by the time we go to the polls?
Look, if Andy Street and Ben Houchen lose their seats, their mayoral Tees and Birmingham.
Other candidates
if they
are
lose,
available.
And we do really badly, other candidates too, and we do really badly in the local elections, it will be very, very difficult.
So he might not be Prime Minister come
He may not be.
All
you
right.
know, Conservative MPs might think, well, we've got till January 2025. If we could change... Boris Johnson turned it around in 6 months.
So he could come in on a white charger?
No, he's not an MP.
Well, who would you prefer to see lead the party at this stage?
Oh, my God, I don't know.
No, indeed. Right, we've got to go to a break. I'm being told in my ear, go to a break, but I could talk to you all morning. Here's the plot. It's Nadine's much talked about book. When's the next book coming out?
I can't say too much at the moment.
You're writing again, which is intriguing in itself.
Well,
Nadine
I
Dorries,
don't
thank
never
you
do
very
another
much.
political
No,
book and
we've
it's
got to
coming
go.
out.
Right, we're going to be speaking about whether we do have a special relationship with America in just a moment. Don't go anywhere.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
This new hate crime bill on women's issues, you think this is the least funny April Fool's joke in history?
Yeah, although the Scottish Government and the Scottish Police do seem to be trying to make a bit of a joke of it when, you know, their campaign Hate Hurts is fronted by a hate monster who's a sort of cuddly, bright red Muppet-style thing. And some of the things that Humza Yousaf said about it were from a soft play centre over the weekend. But yeah, it's really not a joke. It's not actually clever lawyers who know the wording of the law who enforce the law. It's the police. And the police have basically not been trained on this at all. There's a 2-hour online training course they're meant to have done, and lots of them haven't already done it. And we know from the way that the police have been talking about it that they're wildly overstretching what it might actually be to be, in particular, abusive, which is one of the words in the new law, and specifically on the issue of transgender identity. To claim that just noticing the fact that there are two sexes and that sex can't change is meant to be hateful, that, you know, even after years of trying to study it, I can't understand why people hold this belief. But it's part and parcel of a pattern of legal measures that the Scottish Government has either introduced or has sought to introduce. So it tried to introduce gender self-ID, but that was overruled by Westminster because it was out of the power of the devolved government. It's still attempting to bring in a conversion therapy law, which sounds nice but isn't nice. It actually criminalises proper ethical treatment of gender-confused youngsters. They're trying to say that men who have certificates saying that they're women count as women for a particular measure to do with public boards. And then this hate crime law, which tries to make it really difficult for someone to talk in a factual, reality-based, clear, understandable way about all these measures. It all adds up to a sort of an authoritarian attempt to deny the fact that human beings are mammals and come in two sexes, and that recognising that matters for women's rights especially.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News.
Whenever Parliament is in session on a Wednesday at midday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions. We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And why it matters to you. From your doorstep to our inbox.
That's right, we want to hear from you. Good afternoon, Britain. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Mark Dolan, and this is GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. Let's get a left-wing perspective now. We do like to do that on GB News, even though people think, oh, you're right-wing. We have left-wing voices on every show. And this morning, my left-wing voice is going to be former Labour MP and former Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Sean Woodward. Sean, thank you for joining me this morning. Lovely to see you. Can we talk about Angela Rayner? Do you mind? I just feel we must, because it's all over the Sunday papers. There's calls for her to resign. The police are now investigating this two-home situation. She has said, I'll stand down if I'm found criminally liable. Well, she might not be found criminally liable, but she might just be found to have lied. And that's bad in public life, isn't it, Sean?
Oh, of course it's bad. But again, let's not prejudge this. I mean, the first issue is let the Greater Manchester Police do their work now. If there's wrongdoing, she's unequivocal, she will stand down. The other issue you rightly raised, Camilla, is one of perception, and there is an issue very clearly around transparency here. I think it's a matter of regret. It has to be that Angela probably didn't put the documents that she has said would exonerate her position out there. It does slightly mystify me that it's taken quite so long for the Greater Manchester Police to get to this position either. But nonetheless, they are now doing it. So I think the unfortunate thing is this has dragged on now for weeks and weeks. And I think Angela's particular problem here is that she has been somebody who's argued very strongly for standards in public life. Last year, she talked about the importance of establishing an integrity and ethics commissioner if Labour win the next general election. It's very difficult, if you are arguing for that, to not, as it were, be prepared in advance of that, to put into the public domain information which you say you have, but you won't. So I think I've got huge sympathy for her. Anybody who lived through the expenses scandals that I did in Gordon Brown's government knows how really awful this can be, and really pretty nice people can end up being tarred in a very unfair way. But that's the nature of politics. You guys ask the questions. We do have to give the answers. And some people do feel that it's a smear campaign against her and it's about working class women. I think some of that is true, I'm afraid. I think, the media, and you know this, Camilla, once they get on the bandwagon here, they can all get very excited. But the truth is, underneath it all, there is an issue that needs an answer here. And the sooner we get the answer, the better. And if the Greater Manchester Police have to provide it, so be it. But it's a matter of regret to me that we didn't provide it earlier.
Although it sounds to me, I mean, we had John McTiernan on the show last week, and he was very much in the camp of this is a stitch-up, it's a right-wing media conspiracy, there's nothing to see here. You've rightly pointed out that Rayner is someone who has repeatedly called for the resignations of her political opponents. Equally, she's called for people to sort of publish tax returns and all the rest of it. And therefore, she has put herself in a kind of special position.
Yeah.
I suppose the question is, Sean, I mean, are you saying that for the benefit of the Labour Party, even though she serves an important purpose, she's sort of the poster girl for the left, alongside Keir Starmer, that she's becoming a bit of a drag anchor, and if she's more of a hindrance than a help, then she must go, regardless of what the police conclude?
No, I don't think people should be cut loose because there's a media festival going on. I think that would be ludicrous, and that shouldn't happen. On the other hand, I think as somebody who, as it were, says, we're going to have these standards in public life. She's talking about standards, and the standards are what matters here. I think it would be sensible if the person who might be Deputy Prime Minister of our country just clears this up for herself. Look, and let me just add one more thing, Camilla. Tony Blair had John Prescott. I'm in the centre of politics. I wouldn't really regard myself as on the left, but I'm certainly in the centre. I think Angela has a very important role to play in a future Labour government, but like John Prescott, she's got to be prepared to be subjected to this. It's horrid when the media gets going on you, but I'm afraid, as I know and you know, that's the way it is. And by the way, you said earlier in the programme, once a journalist, always a journalist. I was a journalist for 10 years as Esther Ranson's editor of That's Life. And the journalists here are doing their job. I don't think really this is about attacking a working class woman. This is attacking somebody who might be the Deputy Prime Minister and who believes that standards in public life matter. Angela, I'm sure you are innocent. Clear it up.
Clear it up. Thank you very much indeed for your time this morning, Sean Woodward. Wise words, I think, to the wannabe Deputy Prime Minister. Up next, the author Angus Hanton is going to be talking to us about the influence of America on Britain. Don't go anywhere.
Good morning. Welcome to your latest GB News weather from the Met Office. So it's a bit of a drier start for most of us today, but a bit of a chilly start in places, particularly across the north of the UK. It is a dry start across much of Scotland and Northern Ireland, but showers quite quickly pushing in from the west as we head through this morning. England and Wales, though, a much drier and brighter start. Plenty of sunshine as we head through the morning, although there will be some cloud bubbling up as we head through the afternoon. Those showers turning particularly heavy across western parts of Scotland this afternoon, and we could even see some snow across the hills with temperatures closer to average here and a little cooler further south with highs of only 14 or 15 degrees. Through the rest of this evening, those showers becoming much more widespread across the UK, slowly pushing their way south and eastwards as we go into the early hours of Monday morning. The far southeast of England perhaps holding on to some of that drier weather for a time, but those showers will eventually reach all areas of the UK. Another chilly night, particularly across parts of Scotland, temperatures dropping down into the low single figures, but a little less cold further south, maybe 7 or 8 degrees. Monday starts a very showery day across the UK. Those heavy bands of showers continue to push their way south and eastwards through the morning. Some sunny spells developing behind those showers, but with a brisk northwesterly breeze that will definitely take the edge off the temperatures through the day. And we could even continue to see some snow across the hills of northern England and across Scotland. Another chilly day, temperatures in the south only reaching around 12 or 13 degrees.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Dubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially yours. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
GB News is the home of free speech. We were created to champion it, and we deliver it day in, day out.
Free speech allows us all to explore and debate openly the issues most important to us, our families, and of course, the British people.
Having challenging conversations to enlighten each other.
Which is why we hear all sides of the argument.
We are the People's Channel.
We will always stand by the freedom to express yourself.
On TV, radio and online.
This is GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey show on GB News. We're just going to speak to Michael Portillo for what I hope is going to be a high-speed rail summary of what he's got coming up on his show at 11 a.m. Michael.
I'll do that for you. Obviously, we will keep viewers up to date on Iran and Israel. I was struck by Leo Varadkar saying that 400 billion euros would be a small price to pay for Irish unity. That raises the question, what are people willing to pay for cherished political objectives like Brexit and Scottish independence? We're going to be talking about atonal classical music. Has it soaked up all the subsidies and distorted the development of music in general? And there are now some very complicated new taxes on wine. I'm going to be uncorking a few bottles, leading to a fluid discussion, and I hope to get to the bottom of it.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm not condoning drinking before noon, but that sounds fascinating. We'll tune in from 11. Now, I'm joined in the studio by Angus Hampton, the author of a new book, hopefully you can see that, Vassal State, which analyses the historic relationship between the UK and the US. Angus, thanks for coming in this morning. It seems to me that you're suggesting perhaps that this so-called special relationship between Britain and America is actually quite parasitic, and you're describing Britain as the 51st state, which sort of takes me back a little bit to Tony Blair being described as George W. Bush's poodle.
Well, it's almost worse than that. Perhaps we'd be better off if we were the 51st state. We don't have the status that a state has, and it's not about really the historical relationship. It's about the current relationship. Yes. It turns out that what people often call a special relationship has become a very abusive relationship, whether it's in terms of trade or the fact that Britain follows American foreign policy. As you say, a bit like a poodle. But it's all based on the fact that America owns so much of what happens in Britain. There are 1,200 multinationals operating in the UK, and their combined turnover is $700 billion a year. That's equivalent on a per household basis to about £20,000 per household.
Yes.
So there's so much that we don't realise is actually owned by America.
Also, actually, this is a point that was made to me by economists last week, you know, how much of our pensions are indexed at the moment to the so-called Big Seven, and can we continue to ride this wave on the back of the Facebooks and the X's and the rest of it? I mean, you know, that might not be the case in 20 to 30 years' time.
Absolutely. We're very dependent on them in all sorts of ways. And when you go into a supermarket, most of the big brands you come across are American-owned. They dominate the supermarkets. In fact, they own some of the supermarkets. They own Morrison's, for example.
I've just brought over Peter Hitchens' column this morning in the Mail on Sunday because there's a funny line in it. I mean, I thought it was funny, but maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. There were immediate sad cries of, what about the special relationship? But as I keep telling you, there's no such thing. We matter to the Americans slightly more than Bulgaria and much less than Ireland.
Well, what I've found in the book was a retired worker for the American government, and he said we were under instructions to mention the special relationship as often as we could when the Brits were around, but when we were on our own, we laughed behind their backs. So the special relationship is something that works for them. There was an interview with Jane Hartley, the US ambassador, recently, and she mentioned the special relationship 20 times in that interview.
Right.
But it's special for them. To some extent, also, we provide a cover for them. When they're doing what they want to do in the world, it's mentioned that Britain is there too.
I know, but then I suppose the counter-argument to this is obviously our relationship with America is important in the world. I mean, they're a global superpower. And also, I suppose, if you look at sort of life in the UK after the Second World War and after the fall of the Soviet Union and all the rest of it. Who else were we going to align ourselves with?
Well, we were aligned with Europe, and
is there a little bit of Remainer sympathy in this?
There is a bit of Remainer.
Be honest. You can be honest on GB News. We take all views here.
There absolutely is some Remainer sympathy, but there's also the view that if we do relate to America, we should do it more as equals and less as a servant. And it's really costly to Britain.
But you don't want us to be aligning ourselves with Olaf Scholz right now, do you?
What I want is to be more independent. So what we're doing by aligning with America is we're making ourselves dependent on what they want. We're also impoverishing ourselves so that a lot of... Britain now, you don't feel it in London because London is quite a wealthy place by comparison, but taking the whole country, Britain now is about the same level of wealth as the poorest US state, Mississippi.
Yeah.
So we're poorer, and a lot of talented people and go over to the States, so they take our people.
I know, but then you could argue that might be because, we didn't pursue sort of fracking and self-sufficient energy. And secondly, you could say, well, America has historically enjoyed much lower tax rates because they don't have to fund an NHS.
Well, they certainly enjoy lower tax rates when they trade here. One of the things the multinationals do is pay very little tax, and the government could do something about that, and probably should. What they've been forced into is a situation where the sort of global tax rate is going to be 15%. And you may be pleased that that's a apparently low rate, but on the other hand, that's much lower than ordinary UK corporations pay, and small businesses pay. So,
very quick question, as we are running fast out of time. It's been one of those shows this morning, Angus, I'm sorry. Trump, how does his potential re-election as US president change this dynamic, if at all? Does it make it worse?
I don't think it'll make it worse or better. I think the thing is, whichever president is there puts America first. I mean, Trump's slogan, America First, is also Biden's slogan.
Yes.
So I think it's America First at the cost of Britain, and we should do something about it, and we can.
All right, well, if we want to know more about this, Vassal State, here's the book. It's by Angus. It sounds intriguing, to say the very least. Thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you to all of my guests today. We got there, didn't we? I mean, sound issues and all the rest of it, we did get there, as we always do. I will, of course, be back next Sunday at 9:30am, but up next, Michael Portillo is going to be drinking wine before noon. You won't want to go anywhere. Don't miss it. See you next week.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good morning, welcome to your latest GB News weather from the Met Office. So it's a bit of a drier start for most of us today, but a bit of a chilly start in places, particularly across the north of the UK. It is a dry start across much of Scotland and Northern Ireland, but showers quite quickly pushing in from the west as we head through this morning. England and Wales, though, a much drier and brighter start. Plenty of sunshine as we head through the morning, although there will be some cloud bubbling up as we head through the afternoon. Those showers turning particularly heavy across western parts of Scotland this afternoon, and we could even see some snow across the hills, with temperatures closer to average here and a little cooler further south with highs of only 14 or 15 degrees. Through the rest of this evening, those showers becoming much more widespread across the UK, slowly pushing their way south and eastwards as we go into the early hours of Monday morning. The far southeast of England perhaps holding on to some of that drier weather for a time, but those showers will eventually reach all areas of the UK. Another chilly night, particularly across parts of Scotland, temperatures dropping down into the low single figures, but a little less cold further south, maybe 7 or 8 degrees. Monday starts a very showery day across the UK. Those heavy bands of showers continue to push their way south and eastwards through the morning. Some sunny spells developing behind those showers, but with a brisk northwesterly breeze that will definitely take the edge off the temperatures through the day. And we could even continue to see some snow across the hills of northern England and across Scotland. Another chilly day, temperatures in the south only reaching around 12 or 13 degrees.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
This is your chance to win our biggest prize of the year so far. First, there's a totally tax-free £10,000 in cash for you to spend this summer. Then, we want to send you on a bespoke 7-night small boat cruise for two worth £10,000. Thanks to Variety Cruises, you'll be able to choose from any of their 2025 Greek adventures and discover Greece like never before. And with flights, meals, drinks and excursions included, All you have to do is relax. We'll also give you these terrific travel treats. For another chance to win a prize worth over £20,000, text prize to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. Or post your name and number to GB04 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 26th of April. Full terms and privacy notice at gbnews.com/win. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
Our job is to do what's in the best interest of our country.
You made my argument for me. My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
I'm hearing it up and down the country. That was a beginning, not an end.
Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So, send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out. With my panel here on Jubes & Co, we debate, we get stuck into the issues of the day on a show where all views are welcome, especially